This is a PowerPoint presentation on Jesus and the Disinherited, the first chapter from Howard Thurman's book by the same title. This chapter title, obviously is Jesus and Interpretation. And I am doing this because in order for us to talk about liberation, well, of course, obviously we have to do it from the context of who Jesus is. This is a liberation theology class, but I like what Howard Thurman does in this particular chapter is to contextualize all of our discussion, all of our theology around the person of Jesus. So this should be a very brief PowerPoint presentation, but keep in mind though that I will be posting a discussion board post for conversation, and also that you have to write a an analysis of this brief chapter, a short analysis of this chapter. So let's begin. What does Jesus have to do with liberation? It's best for us to define liberation before we get into the concept of what liberation theology is. Liberation is the act of freeing someone or something from another's control. That other could be another person, it could be an institution, it could be a systemic way of thinking. But the act of liberation is an act of freeing. That is, letting someone go from something or someone. So, one of the primary questions that we have to deal with is freedom from what? As I said, it could be freedom from a person or a group of people. It can be freedom from institutionalized oppression or institutionalized things that will prevent you from doing what you normally would do as a free person. For instance, from the African American context, is the freedom from enslavement. Not only was that freedom from individual people, but freedom from an institutionalized, systemic way of thinking that, quite frankly, at least in this country, people are still struggling with. A second question is to ask freedom to what? If you are being freed from something, what are you being freed to do that you normally could not have done before? Freedom to move, freedom to think, freedom to speak. There are various answers to what your freedom is aiming toward. What is the goal of freedom? What is it you would want to do that you normally could not do? And the third question is why? Why do you want to be free? Is your current situation of such that you need to be freed from it? And this is a personal question, a group question, a question that has to be asked at all points along the process of liberation. If it's about being free, why do you want freedom? So these are some questions that have to be asked in terms of talking about liberation. But again, liberation simply defined is the act of freeing someone or something from another's control. And we also have to distinguish salvation from liberation. It is always a question with me whenever I talk about liberation theology. Am I talking about the same thing as saying I want your soul to be saved? That is freeing you from the vicissitudes of sin, freeing you from the outcome of sin. But as we go along in this term, we will learn that although there may be some commonality, salvation is not the same thing as liberation. First of all, salvation as quantitative or qualitative. In the early church, it was a matter of getting numbers into the fold. That is, quantities, so that the church could grow, so that the church could expand, so that the church could spread its message along the way. And as time progressed, as many more became involved in churches, we're not going to get to church history here, but the church grew. And at a certain point, the question began to be asked, what is the quality of your salvation? That is, what are the indicators of your salvation? A common question that we may have heard recently in our own lives is, do you know Jesus Christ in the pardoning of your sins? That is a qualitative question. That is, what do you show in terms of you being saved? So salvation is both quantitative and still qualitative. I guess, especially in our current age with how a lot of our churches are, not just AME churches, but a lot of our black churches are losing numbers exponentially. So there's always an effort of going out evangelizing to bring more souls into the church. That is, bringing numbers into the church, and also the quality of that salvation. So now with liberation, though, if we look at this prior meeting, the act of freeing someone or something from another's control, that's not really about salvation, unless we're talking about saving from oppression. But those, that's a fine, distinct, nuanced response. Liberation is more talking about the physical freedom, the existential freedom from oppression. Because again, in a certain point of our history, the people didn't care if we were saved or not, as long as they kept us in bondage. So there's a difference between being saved, strictly defined, and being liberated, strictly defined. This leads to the question about Jesus. Jesus and the poor or the oppressed. Oh, I'm sorry. Jesus and salvation. Jesus and liberation, and how he responds to that. What is his core values? And for that, we need to take a look at Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, where Jesus talks about his program, his programmatic statement. He first of all says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he, the Lord, has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." These are all things that Jesus said about himself. He could not do it without first being anointed. That is, he could not engage in liberation acts until he had an inner conviction. And if we look at this statement, there's nothing about saving anyone. That is how we think about salvation. This is a programmatic statement about liberation. Jesus is on the side of the poor, the oppressed, the locked up, those who are blind. These are the things that Jesus was talking about. It is a very real sense that Jesus had a preferential option for the poor. You will hear this term quite often in liberation theology. Preferential, a preferential option for the poor. Um, that is, we must be able to create conditions for the poor to be heard. We must defend the defenseless. We must speak truth to oppressive powers. Even, my brothers and my sisters, even if that oppressive power is the institutionalized church. That is, we must have a preferential option for the poor. such that the poor can speak for themselves, such that the poor can defend themselves, such that the poor can rise up and have the freedom to do what they normally could not have done. And that takes commitment on the part of those who engage in liberation theology. From Thurman's book, and this is really key in terms of liberation theology. The masses of people live with their backs constantly against the wall. They are the poor, the disinherited, the dispossessed. And quite frankly, what does our religion say to them? And that is a very key question. If you read this chapter from Thurman, you would find that oftentimes, although what Jesus started was an act of liberation, as the church grew and expanded, it became a tool of the oppressors. It became a tool to put the poor down. It became a tool for its own self-aggrandizement. So the question really becomes, what does the church, what do we say to these masses of people who are disinherited, who are dispossessed, who are poor, who are oppressed? What commitment can the church make to them? And he goes on further, and he says that there is one overmastering problem that the socially and politically disinherited always face. Under what terms is survival possible? And the key is always about survival. The key is about living from day to day. The question is about how can I put food on the table? The question is about how do I live with dignity? The question is about how can I hold my head up when I know that all the world is against me? And these are the masses of the people. We are privileged that for those of us who have a certain kind of lifestyle, we don't face these questions. The very real existential questions of living from day to day. That is not our concern. So the answer to this question is pre-theological. And what that really means is that before we go in, start talking about God and Jesus and asking that qualitative question about are you saved, the people want to know, can you help me with my bill? Can you help me put food on my table? Can you help me to get my son out of jail? Can you help me to deal with my day-to-day existence? That's a pre-theological concern. And you will read this in Boff about how we deal with liberation. There's a first step prior to God talk. That means really asking the question, how do we deal with real life situations? And Jesus himself understood that what he dealt with in his time, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, those people who were a part of the institutionalized synagogue, they could not really answer that question because they had been so much a part of oppressive forces. So he had to really deal with issues on a personal level, that is, on a day-to-day level. And likewise, the question for us as the church is, without normative understandings of what Christianity means, what can we really say to the poor? How can we help them to survive? This is a question that we have to deal with. This is the question of liberation theology. Are we ready to engage in it? Are we ready to have a preferential option for the poor? Or are we simply about getting the next best church? And this is what we will be dealing with as we go along in this term. But I wanted to make sure that I laid the groundwork with this chapter from Howard Thurman so that we could really begin grappling and wrestling with these issues. As I said, I will be posting a discussion board topic, and I also have a YouTube video of, I think, about a 6 to 7 minute sermon from this guy talking about Jesus and the disinherited. I want you to take a look at it and critique it in some form or fashion. But I will post the instructions for that a little bit later on.